Today's story comes straight from New Orleans, Louisiana. My name is Audrey, and I thought I had my chaotic life under control until one seemingly ordinary evening changed everything forever. I pulled into the driveway of my small rental apartment after an exhausting double shift at the docks when I saw two small figures huddled together on my porch. My heart stopped because they were shivering violently next to a single tattered duffel bag that looked completely empty. I approached them slowly to realize it was my nephew Mason and my niece Tessa looking up at me with terrified eyes while the freezing rain soaked them to the bone. A crumpled piece of paper was pinned to Mason's jacket, so I snatched it up with trembling hands to read the message. The note was written by my sister Carla, and it was cold enough to freeze my blood. She explicitly stated that she needed to find a new life for herself and demanded that I must not try to search for or contact her under any circumstances. Those heartless words hit me harder than a physical blow because she had chosen to abandon her own children without even a conversation or a goodbye. The weight of responsibility crashed down on me instantly, since this was clearly a deliberate act rather than an accident. I ushered the freezing children inside my warm living room before locking the door behind us to shut out the cruel world she left us in. I stared at the note in disbelief while trying to process how a mother could walk away from her babies. The silence in the room was deafening as I realized she had planned this exit to escape her responsibilities while dumping the burden entirely on me. If your own sister abandoned her kids on your doorstep and disappeared without a trace, what would you do? Drop a comment below to share your thoughts, and make sure you subscribe to follow this intense story of family betrayal and ultimate justice. The unrelenting rain from the previous night continued to hammer against the windows of the local bank branch, as I stood at the counter waiting for answers that I knew would devastate me. I watched the bank teller type something into her computer before she looked up with a sympathetic expression that immediately made my stomach turn over in dread. She informed me in a hushed tone that the joint savings account I had maintained for years had been completely liquidated and closed just yesterday afternoon. I gripped the cold marble counter for support while the room seemed to spin because that account held every penny I had saved for emergency expenses. The nightmare did not end there because the teller handed me a printed document showing a substantial high-interest personal loan that had been taken out in my name only 2 days prior. Carla had used my social security number and personal information to commit identity theft, which left me responsible for a debt that I could never hope to repay on my salary. I walked out of the bank feeling like a hollow shell because she had not just left me with the children, but had also strapped a financial bomb to my chest before disappearing. I drove back to the rental house with a desperate hope that she might have left the one thing that truly mattered to our family history. I ran straight to the bedroom closet and pried up the loose floorboard where we always kept the antique jewelry box that belonged to our late mother. My heart sank into the pit of my stomach when I saw nothing but darkness and dust in the empty space where the velvet box used to sit. Carla had stolen the only tangible memory we had left of our mother, which proved she had been planning this exit strategy for weeks while looking me in the eye. I sat on the floor staring at the empty hiding spot until a loud banging on the front door forced me to snap back to the immediate reality. My current landlord was standing on the porch with a face red from anger while he pointed at the pile of bags he had already thrown onto the wet sidewalk. He shouted over the sound of the rain that he was done listening to excuses about the rent being late for the 3rd month in a row. I tried to explain that I had no idea the rent was unpaid, but he cut me off to say that Carla had promised him I would cover the arrears today. He blocked the doorway with his large frame and told me that he had already changed the locks, so I needed to take the kids and leave immediately. The humiliation burned my cheeks as I realized she had lied to everyone to buy herself enough time to escape with the cash while leaving us homeless. Just as panic threatened to paralyze me completely on that rain-soaked sidewalk, my best friend Sarah pulled up to the curb in her battered pickup truck. She did not waste time asking questions or offering empty pity because she could see the desperate situation clearly enough from the pile of garbage bags next to me. Sarah jumped out to help me load the few belongings the landlord had not destroyed into the truck bed, while the rain plastered her hair to her face. She told me about a vacancy in a dilapidated building on the edge of the city owned by an eccentric old man named Mr. Owen, who accepted tenants with bad credit. I climbed into the passenger seat with Mason and Tessa squeezed between us, while Sarah navigated the truck toward the part of New Orleans that tourists never visited. We arrived at a crumbling brick building where the streetlights flickered ominously and the air smelled heavy with mildew and stagnant water. Mr. Owen met us at the entrance with a ring of keys in his hand and eyes that seemed to assess my desperation without saying a word. The apartment was actually a converted basement unit with peeling paint and exposed pipes that rattled every time the water was turned on upstairs. I signed the lease agreement without reading the fine print because we had absolutely nowhere else to go, and the sun was already setting. Sarah helped us carry the mattress inside before giving me a tight hug that communicated all the strength she wished she could lend me. I looked around the damp room that was now our home and realized we were starting over with nothing but a mountain of debt and 2 traumatized children. The first 5 years passed slowly like a slow-motion film of misery and deadlock as we struggled to survive in the underbelly of New Orleans. My daily existence became a grueling cycle of 18-hour shifts that left my body aching in places I did not know existed. I spent my mornings hauling heavy crates at the fish docks where the stench of raw seafood permeated my skin no matter how hard I scrubbed with cheap soap. The nights were even harder because I washed endless stacks of greasy plates at a noisy jazz club on Bourbon Street just to make the minimum payments on the fraudulent loans Carla had saddled me with. I barely saw the children awake during the week, which filled me with a constant guilt that weighed heavier than the crates I lifted every morning. The financial exhaustion paled in comparison to the emotional toll that the abandonment took on Mason as he entered his turbulent teenage years. He transformed from a terrified boy into a sullen and withdrawn adolescent who frequently skipped classes to avoid the whispers of his classmates. The situation reached a breaking point when I received an urgent phone call from the principal, stating that Mason had been suspended for breaking another student's nose during a lunchroom brawl. I had to leave my shift at the docks early to drag him home, while trying to suppress the rising panic that I was failing to raise him properly. The tension exploded the moment we stepped inside our damp apartment, as I demanded to know why he was throwing away the future I was working myself to death to provide for him. Mason did not back down this time, but instead shoved a wooden chair across the room with a violence that made me flinch against the doorframe. He looked me dead in the eye with tears streaming down his face and screamed that I should have just let him go. "Why did you keep me? You should have thrown me away like she did." His words sliced through my heart because they revealed the deep wound of worthlessness that Carla had inflicted upon him when she walked out that door without looking back. I stood there frozen in silence because I did not know how to heal a child who believed he was inherently unlovable. The commotion was loud enough to bring Mr. Owen downstairs from his unit to see what was happening in our living room. I expected him to threaten eviction for the noise, but he simply looked at the overturned chair and then at the trembling boy standing in the center of the chaos. He told Mason in a gravelly voice to stop acting like a victim and ordered him to come out to the back workshop immediately. Mr. Owen did not offer pity or soft words, but instead handed Mason a screwdriver and a broken microwave that he had pulled from a dumpster earlier that day. He instructed the boy to take it apart piece by piece to understand how it worked, rather than using his hands to hurt people. That dusty workshop full of rusted metal became a sanctuary where Mason learned to channel his rage into precise mechanical movements under Mr. Owen's strict supervision. It was not long before neighbors started bringing their broken toasters and radios, which Mason repaired with a surprising natural intuition that earned him his first honest dollars. While Mason found his purpose among the scrap metal, I was fighting a quiet battle of my own in the sterile hallways of the family court system. I spent my few free hours meeting with an overworked public defender who helped me navigate the complex mountain of paperwork required to sever Carla's legal ties to the children. The process was exhausting but necessary because I needed to ensure she could never return to drag them back into her instability. The judge finally granted the adoption decree on a humid Tuesday morning, which officially made me their mother in the eyes of the law, even though I had already earned that title through sweat and tears. 8 years after Carla left, a ray of hope sparked in the damp, grease-filled garage that had become our sanctuary against the world. Mason spent every waking moment outside of school holed up in that dimly lit space surrounded by mountains of electronic waste that he had scavenged from the local dump. He was no longer just repairing broken toasters for pocket money, because his ambition had grown into something far more complex and revolutionary than we could comprehend. He was building a prototype for an automated waste sorting system that utilized artificial intelligence to identify and separate recyclable materials from general garbage with pinpoint accuracy. The contraption was a Frankenstein creation made of conveyor belts from broken treadmills and optical sensors salvaged from discarded webcams, but it hummed with a promising energy. I stood in the doorway one humid afternoon, watching him run a full demonstration of the machine using a bag of mixed trash he had collected from the street corner. The robotic arm moved with a terrifying speed as it snatched plastic bottles and aluminum cans from the moving belt before tossing them into separate bins without missing a single item. Mr. Owen was leaning against his workbench with an unlit cigar in his mouth, while he watched the mechanical spectacle with wide eyes that betrayed his usual stoic demeanor. He walked over to the machine once it powered down and picked up a sorted piece of copper wire before looking at Mason with a newfound respect. He shook his head in disbelief and slapped Mason on the shoulder hard enough to make the boy stumble forward slightly. "Kid, this isn't trash. It's pure gold." His validation meant the world to Mason, but it terrified me because I knew that turning a garage invention into a business required capital that we simply did not possess. That evening, I sat Mason down at our small kitchen table and placed a heavy envelope in front of him, which contained the meager savings I had scraped together for his college tuition. I told him that he needed to use this money to get a degree in engineering so he could find a stable job that would never leave him vulnerable like I was. Mason looked at the envelope with a pained expression before sliding it back across the scarred wooden table toward me without opening it. He explained that university would take 4 years of our lives, but his technology was ready to solve the city's waste crisis right now. "I cannot let you throw away your education on a machine that might never work," I said with a trembling voice as the fear of poverty clawed at my throat. "College takes 4 years to pay off, but this invention can change our lives right now." Mason replied with a conviction that made him look so much older than his 18 years. The argument escalated quickly because my trauma from Carla's financial betrayal made me risk-averse while Mason was fueled by the desperate need to prove his worth to the world. I stood up to walk away because I could not bear the thought of him losing everything on a gamble that felt too dangerous for people like us. Mason reached out and grabbed my hand with a grip that was both gentle and incredibly strong, which forced me to stop and look at him. He looked deep into my eyes with an intensity that burned through my defenses and spoke the words that would ultimately seal our fate. "You sacrificed your whole life for me. Let me gamble this time for you." Those words broke through the wall of fear I had built around our lives because I realized he was no longer a child who needed protection, but a man who needed a partner. I spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling fan while weighing the safety of a degree against the brilliance I saw in that garage. The next morning, I drove my battered pickup truck to a used car dealership on the other side of town with a heaviness in my chest. That truck was my only means of getting to the docks and the jazz club, but it was also the only asset of value I possessed in this world. I handed over the keys and the title to the dealer for a sum of cash that felt pitifully small compared to the sentimental value of the vehicle. I walked the 5 miles back home with the cash hidden securely in my jacket pocket, while making a mental plan of how I would manage the bus schedule for my 2 jobs. When I arrived at the house, I went straight to Mr. Owen and asked him for a loan to cover the remaining cost of the server equipment Mason needed. Mr. Owen did not ask for collateral or a repayment schedule because he believed in Mason's vision just as much as I did. We pooled every cent we had to purchase a refurbished high-capacity server that would power the artificial intelligence needed to run the sorting algorithm. The three of us spent the next weekend clearing out the remaining junk from the garage and moving the furniture out of our living room to create a workspace. We set up folding tables and whiteboards where the television used to be, and placed the humming server in the coolest corner of the room. Mason took a black marker and wrote the name Clean Future on a piece of cardboard, which he taped proudly to the front door of our apartment. We had no safety net left to catch us if we fell, which meant failure was absolutely not an option for any of us. The early days of our startup were nothing like the glamorous success stories that filled the pages of business magazines, but rather a brutal test of our endurance. Mason spent months cold-calling potential investors from our cramped living room, only to face a relentless wall of rejection and condescension. He would put on his only suit, which I had bought from a thrift store, and take the bus to downtown meetings only to return hours later with his shoulders slumped in defeat. The investors looked at his youth and lack of a university degree as insurmountable liabilities rather than seeing the brilliance of his creation. They sneered at our business address in the slums and told him that serious technology companies were not built in basements next to the fish market. The situation became dire when a massive tropical storm system swept in from the Gulf of Mexico and aimed straight for New Orleans. The meteorologists warned of catastrophic winds and flooding that threatened to destroy the fragile infrastructure of our neighborhood. The storm hit with a ferocity that shook the foundations of Mr. Owen's old building and plunged the entire city into immediate darkness as the power grid collapsed. This was a nightmare scenario because the servers running the artificial intelligence learning models required constant cooling and power to prevent data corruption. Mason panicked as the backup batteries began to drain rapidly because losing that data meant losing years of work that could never be replicated. Mr. Owen sprang into action with the vigor of a much younger man and dragged an ancient diesel generator out of his storage shed into the howling wind. He spent the next 3 days and nights battling the elements to keep that noisy machine running while the rain lashed against his face. I frantically nailed heavy plywood over the windows and used tarps to shield the sensitive electronic equipment from the water leaking through the ceiling. Mason sat hunched over his keyboard in the flickering light of a single lantern while he frantically rewrote code to optimize the system for low-power mode. We did not sleep for 72 hours as we fought a desperate war against nature to save the only hope we had for a better future. In the midst of this chaotic struggle for survival, my niece Tessa found a different way to contribute to the fight. She picked up her cracked smartphone and began filming us as we worked tirelessly to keep the dream alive against the storm. She captured the raw emotion of Mr. Owen pouring fuel into the generator and the exhaustion on Mason's face as he typed with trembling fingers. She edited the footage into a short emotional video that highlighted our struggle to build a green technology company from the ruins of poverty. She uploaded the clip to social media without telling anyone because she wanted to show the world the reality of our resilience. The storm finally passed on the 4th morning, leaving behind a city battered but still standing under a clear blue sky. I was making coffee on a camping stove when a sudden shout from the living room made me drop the spoon in surprise. Mason was staring at his laptop screen with his mouth wide open and tears welling up in his tired eyes. He called out to me with a voice that cracked from a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming joy as he pointed a shaking finger at the analytics dashboard. "Aunt Audrey, look at this. We aren't dead. The whole world is watching us." I rushed over to see that Tessa's video had gone viral overnight and accumulated millions of views from people all across the country. The comments section was flooded with messages of support and admiration for the family that refused to let a hurricane destroy their innovation. The story of a young genius building a robot to save the planet while fighting poverty resonated deeply with the American spirit of determination. The viral fame translated almost instantly into tangible success as our email inbox began to overflow with inquiries from waste management companies. We received prepaid orders for the waste sorting units that provided enough capital to secure our operations for the next 2 years. The investors who had previously dismissed Mason were now calling his phone relentlessly, but he let their calls go straight to voicemail. We had survived the storm and the rejection to emerge stronger than ever, thanks to the power of our story. The garage that once smelled of despair was now the headquarters of a company that the whole nation was rooting for. 4 years after that fateful storm, our lives had changed completely in ways that I still struggled to comprehend when I looked in the mirror. The little startup that began in a damp garage had grown into Clean Future, which was now a corporate titan valued at hundreds of millions of dollars on the stock market. We had become the undeniable symbol of green technology and reconstruction for the entire southern region of the United States, which was desperate for innovation. The robotic sorting systems that Mason designed were now installed in every major city from Houston to Atlanta, cleaning up the environment while generating massive profits. I was no longer washing dishes at the jazz club because I was now the chief operations officer of a company that employed over 5,000 people. The pinnacle of this public recognition arrived when Mason received an exclusive invitation to appear on the most famous late-night talk show in the country. We flew to New York City on a private jet, which felt like a fever dream compared to the days when we could barely afford bus fare. I sat in the front row of the studio audience next to Tessa, who had grown into a stunning and sharp young woman who managed our public relations. The stage lights were blindingly bright as the charismatic host introduced Mason as the youngest self-made billionaire in American history. Mason walked out wearing a tailored Italian suit that fit him perfectly and sat down with a confidence that commanded the attention of millions of viewers. The interview started with standard questions about the technology and the future of waste management, which Mason answered with his usual brilliance and charm. Then the host leaned forward with a serious expression and asked the question that everyone wanted to know about his personal journey. Mason, you came from absolutely nothing to build an empire. What was the driving force that kept you going when everyone else said no? The studio went silent as the camera zoomed in on Mason's face, which softened with an emotion that I knew all too well. He looked past the cameras and the host directly into the darkness of the audience where he knew I was sitting. He did not talk about his genius or his hard work or the desire to prove his critics wrong. The only hero in my life is my Aunt Audrey, who sold the only car she owned to buy the server that built this dream. He continued to speak to the nation about how I had taken them in when they had nothing and sacrificed my own future so they could have one. I squeezed Tessa's hand so hard that my knuckles turned white, while tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. The audience erupted into thunderous applause that shook the seats, but I could only focus on the boy I had raised who was now a man acknowledging our shared battle. It was the moment where every hour of backbreaking labor at the docks and every night of humiliation felt completely justified and rewarded. We returned to New Orleans not just as business moguls, but as a family that had conquered its demons through sheer force of will. We decided that it was finally time to leave the shadows of our past behind and establish a permanent sanctuary for our future. We purchased a magnificent French colonial villa in the historic Garden District, which was famous for its wrought iron balconies and ancient oak trees. The house was massive, with enough rooms for all of us to have our own private spaces without ever feeling crowded again. We insisted that Mr. Owen move in with us because he was the grandfather these children deserved and the mentor who had saved Mason. He grumbled about the house being too fancy for an old mechanic, but I saw him smiling when he walked into the state-of-the-art workshop we built for him in the carriage house. Life settled into a rhythm of luxury and peace that we had never dared to imagine during those long nights in the slum apartment. We hosted charity galas in our garden and appeared on the covers of major business magazines as the Golden Family of American Innovation. Mason and Tessa were featured in articles that praised their resilience and their incredible rise from tragedy to triumph. Our faces were plastered on newsstands and television screens across the country, which meant our story was unavoidable for anyone paying attention. We were living in the light, but we forgot that the brighter the light shines, the deeper the shadows become. Somewhere in the darkness of the world, our success had caught the attention of the one person we hoped had forgotten us forever. On the very night of the company anniversary party at the new house, the past came knocking at our door to demand a payment we did not owe. The expansive living room of our Garden District villa was filled with the soft murmur of jazz music and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes as we celebrated another record-breaking year for Clean Future. I excused myself from a conversation with a potential investor when the doorbell rang, with a persistent urgency that seemed out of place amidst the laughter and celebration. I walked across the polished marble foyer expecting to find a late courier or perhaps a neighbor complaining about the music, but instead, I found myself staring into a distorted mirror of yesterday. The woman standing on the other side of the heavy oak door was a ghostly shell of the sister I once knew, her face etched with deep lines of hardship and her clothes hanging loosely on a frail frame. I stood there frozen in a state of absolute shock as my mind struggled to reconcile this haggard stranger with the vibrant woman who had abandoned us 12 years ago. Carla did not wait for an invitation, but instead pushed past me with a shocking audacity that sucked the air right out of the room. She walked into the grand hallway as if she had simply stepped out for a pack of cigarettes an hour ago, rather than leaving us to rot for over a decade. The festive chatter in the living room died down instantly as the guests noticed the disheveled intruder standing on the Persian rug with mud on her worn-out shoes. Carla looked around the room with eyes that did not hold a single ounce of remorse or maternal longing, but instead burned with a naked greed that she made no effort to hide. She scanned the crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling and the expensive art on the walls as if she were mentally calculating their pawnshop value. She finally turned her gaze toward me and launched into a rehearsed monologue that was so twisted it almost made me laugh out loud in disbelief. She claimed that she had been watching us from afar the entire time, and that her disappearance was actually a noble sacrifice, designed to give the children the motivation they needed to succeed. I had to break my own heart and leave, so you kids would learn how to fight for your lives, she said with a trembling voice that was clearly a performance for the audience. The sheer narcissism of her statement made my blood boil because she was trying to rewrite her cowardice as a strategic act of tough love. She then turned her venom toward me and accused me of stealing the affection of her children while she was out in the cold suffering for their sake. She painted herself as the victim of circumstance while ignoring the fact that she had stolen my identity and left us homeless in the middle of a thunderstorm. Carla turned her attention to Tessa, who was standing near the fireplace looking stunning in a designer silk gown that matched her success. The woman smiled with a sickening sweetness and opened her arms wide as she took a step toward the daughter she had discarded like garbage years ago. "Come here to mommy, daughter, I missed you to death." The room was silent enough to hear a pin drop as everyone waited to see how the young heiress would react to this emotional ambush. Tessa did not freeze or cry as she might have done when she was a helpless 5-year-old child begging for her mother. She took a deliberate step backward behind me to create a physical barrier between herself and the woman who gave birth to her. She looked at Carla with an expression of pure disgust that was sharper than any knife and delivered a response that shattered the tension in the room completely. "Don't touch me, you'll dirty this dress." Her voice was cold and steady, stripping away any power Carla thought she held over the situation in a single sentence. I instinctively moved to stand between Carla and the children to shield them, just as I had done on that rainy night 12 years ago. However, as I looked at the steel in Tessa's eyes and the calm fury radiating from Mason, I realized that the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. I did not need to speak for them anymore, because the children I raised had grown into warriors who were more than capable of fighting their own battles against the ghosts of the past. Mason slowly walked down the grand curved staircase holding a thick manila folder in his hand, while his eyes remained as cold as the ice in our champagne buckets. The guests parted ways instinctively to create a wide path for him as he approached the center of the foyer where the confrontation was unfolding. He moved with the calculated precision of a CEO who was accustomed to crushing hostile takeovers and dismantling opponents who underestimated him. He stopped directly in front of the trembling woman who claimed to be his mother and looked down at her with a gaze that contained absolutely zero recognition. The silence in the room was so profound that I could hear the terrified, shallow breathing of the woman who had once abandoned him without a second thought. Carla opened her mouth to launch into another manipulative speech about family bonds, but Mason cut her off with a simple question that carried the weight of a death sentence. "Who are you?" Carla flinched as if she had been slapped across the face because his tone implied she was nothing more than an unwelcome stranger trespassing on private property. She frantically tried to stammer out an explanation about being the woman who gave birth to him and attempted to reach for his hand to establish a physical connection. She pleaded desperately that blood was thicker than water and that she had returned to claim her rightful place as the matriarch of this wealthy family. However, Tessa stepped forward from behind me and stood shoulder to shoulder with her brother to deliver the final verdict on their biological connection. "My mom is dead. She died in the rain 12 years ago." The brutal finality of that statement hung in the air for a moment before Mason slammed the heavy file onto the marble console table with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. The folder spilled open to reveal a decade of meticulously preserved documents, including the original police reports regarding the identity theft and the bank statements showing the unauthorized loans. I had kept every single scrap of evidence regarding the financial crimes Carla had committed before she fled the state, just in case this day ever arrived. Mason pointed a steady finger at the damning papers, which clearly displayed her forged signatures and the outstanding warrants that were still active in the system. He leaned in close enough for her to see the unyielding resolve in his eyes and delivered an ultimatum that left no room for negotiation. "Either you get out of this state immediately, or I will call the police to arrest you for financial fraud and child abandonment." The color drained completely from Carla's face as she realized that the statute of limitations had been paused due to her flight from the jurisdiction, and she was now facing serious felony charges. She looked from Mason's steely gaze to the file on the table and finally understood that she was not dealing with a helpless child she could manipulate anymore. She was facing a powerful billionaire who had the limitless resources and the sheer will to put her behind bars for the rest of her miserable life. The arrogance that had carried her through the front door evaporated instantly, leaving behind only the naked fear of facing legitimate consequences for her past actions. She looked around the opulent room one last time, realizing that the luxury she coveted would never be hers because she had traded it for a quick escape years ago. She backed away slowly at first, and then turned to flee through the open front door into the darkness like a frightened animal scurrying away from a predator. We watched her run down the long driveway until she disappeared into the night without looking back once because she knew there was nothing left for her here. The sound of her footsteps fading into the distance marked the absolute end of the shadow that had hung over our lives for 12 long years. Mason turned to me, and the ice in his eyes melted away instantly to be replaced by a warm smile as he signaled for the jazz band to resume playing. The party continued into the night, but this time the laughter was lighter and the champagne tasted sweeter because we knew that the ghosts of the past were gone forever. This journey from a rainy doorstep in the slums to a mansion in the Garden District proves that true family is defined by action rather than genetics. We learned that betrayal may leave scars, but those scars can become the roadmap to a destiny greater than we ever imagined. The woman who gave birth to them chose herself and ended up with nothing but fear and loneliness, while the aunt who chose them ended up with everything. It serves as a powerful reminder that karma always balances the scales, because those who sow abandonment will eventually harvest a lifetime of regret. Thank you so much for listening to this emotional story of resilience and justice all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts on whether Carla deserved forgiveness or if she got exactly what she deserved.